Hey Artnerds, today we're starting a new series where I show you guys how to draw a bunch of different types of flowers. Today we're going to be starting with a water lily. This is the image that I use for my reference. This water lily was drawn in preparation for an online watercolor marker workshop that I held here on YouTube. I'll link that in the description below as well. So the materials you're going to use for this tutorial are pretty simple. I'm going to be sketching this on watercolor paper, and I have a pencil, and then later you're going to need the inking materials of your preference. So I am just using a plain old erasable mechanical pencil with H lead in it, nothing super fancy. And I'm starting with kind of a round shape. Not really a circle, I'm thinking more like a bowl or a disc. And I'm subdividing that shape to help me place the center of the water lily accurately. So at this stage, everything is really loose and everything's pretty rough. Once I have my bowl shape, I'm going to start sketching individual petals. And as you guys can see, petals are kind of egg-shaped. They're pointed at the top and maybe flattened at the bottom as they go into the flower itself. Now, the thing to keep in mind about these petal shapes is that they are not always going to look like this. Petals kind of curve in on themselves. So I am paying close attention to what I'm seeing going on in the water lily reference. And when you're first starting out drawing flowers, you don't have a lot of experience and you don't have a mental library to draw from, practicing closely from reference is a great way to sort of build up those skill sets, and regularly practicing is another great way to kind of hone those skill sets. If you're only able to do this infrequently, it's going to be a lot harder to improve. However, drawing something like this, at least just drawing it, is very simple and it doesn't take a lot of time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And if you do just a little bit every day, you're going to see your skills increase a lot. So the thing about water lilies is it has like 3 rings of petals. So we're starting with the interior ring of petals, the layer of petals closest to the center. So you can see in that little sketch down at the bottom, I'm trying to show you guys how we have at least 3 rings of petals. Sometimes there's an additional stray petal here and there, but it's about 3 rings of petals. So once we have that center ring drawn in, we're going to draw the second ring. And what's interesting about the second ring is not as many of these petals are folded in on themselves, and also you start to get some overlap. And it's really important to draw this overlap because it's going to give your flower a sense of depth and dimension. If you just draw 3 rings of petals, no overlap whatsoever, no irregularity, it's going to look very synthetic and fake. It's going to feel very stagnant. Whereas if you draw some overlap, if you have some areas that have more petals, some areas that have fewer petals, it's going to feel more organic and more like a living thing. Because living things do have these sort of imperfections that add a beauty to them. So here's our rough sketch of the flower. Just everything's kind of been placed at this point. I draw everything really loose and really rough at this stage because I can always go in and tighten my details a little bit more. So now I'm moving in towards the center and drawing the individual stamens that are coming out, and they're kind of like little hair-like shapes. They're radiating from the center of the flower, and the ones that are closest to us, the viewer, are extremely foreshortened. So I'm just kind of freehanding them as kind of like rectangular block shapes. We're just drawing the tips of the stamens in that instance. Okay, so our flower has been just about sketched in. We're going to start drawing in the water lily pads, the lily pads actually, in our next step. So these are pretty simple. This is the stage where if I want to change things, I'm really going to change things to suit the composition. Now, the water lily also has these really large white petals. They're probably not actually petals. They're probably the sepals. And then we're also going to start sketching in our lily pad shapes in the background. So with the lily pads, we're not drawing what we think lily pads look like. We're drawing what the reference shows the lily pads looks like. So they're not perfectly round. They're kind of oblong, looser shapes. So we have finished our sketch. Next, I'm going to start inking my water lily. And Bowie is meowing in the background to remind you guys that if you enjoy the work I do and you want to help support more of it, you guys can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/nattosoup. So the materials I'm going to be using for inking at this point are a Pigma FB and a Pentel Pigment brush pen. But I recommend you use what you're comfortable with using. Now, the reason I like the Pigma FB is it's a brush pen, so it has some flex, but it's very easy to use, and it is both waterproof and alcohol marker proof, which is going to make it ideal for use in my upcoming watercolor marker workshop. So generally when I'm inking, I begin with the center of focus or anything that might overlap that focus. So that's why I drew that one overlapping petal. And now I'm going in and I'm starting to ink the center of our flower. And what's nice about brush pens is they can give you variable width, so you don't just get a stagnant flat liner. Now sometimes you want that, sometimes that's the look you're going for. You're going for something that looks a little bit more graphic, or maybe you're just not comfortable with using brush pens yet. That's fine. If you're looking for a good technical pen or felt tip pen recommendation, I really like the Sakura Microns. You can get them all sorts of different places, and they utilize the same ink that the Pigma uses, so it's going to be waterproof and it's going to be alcohol marker proof once you've allowed it to cure. And you're going to want to let it cure for about 24 hours. So you guys can see I'm just kind of going bit by bit. I'm not actually sure if these are stamens or pistils on this type of flower. I'm pretty sure they're stamens, but I'm sure I have some botany friends who will let me know down in the comments which it is in this illustration. But as you guys can see, I'm just kind of inking each individual hair, but I'm not trying to add too much detail to that. You kind of want to vary how much detail you add, because if you have way too much detail in the whole flower, it's going to be very overwhelming. I'm coming at this from a very comic artist, cartoony perspective. Generally, when I'm drawing flowers, I'm thinking about how I can simplify the forms, how I can capture the essence of the flower, and how I can capture the most important information. Rather than doing a perfect and proficient line drawing, I'm really trying to capture how the flower feels to me. Okay, so now that we have the center finished, it's time to go petal by petal. And I'm trying to ink with a really, really light, loose hand. We're going to have some stop and go lines. We're going to have a lot of variable line width. In general, where the light source would be, so in this instance, maybe the light source is coming from the sun, so the tops of the petals are going to have a thinner line art than the bottoms of the petals. I'm also adding just a few lines here and there to kind of help define the form of the petals. You really want to keep this to a minimum, and you want those lines to be lighter than the lines you're using to ink the rest of the petal. And I'm just going to kind of go my way around each circle of petals, inking them as I go. As I mentioned earlier, I usually ink overlap before I ink the things underneath it. So that's why you see this particularly curly petal here. I kind of skipped inking the petal before it so I could ink that overlap. And you want those contour lines to be in the same direction that your petal's curving in. If you're not comfortable doing them, or if you don't like how they look, you don't have to do them. You can skip them. I like what they add to my illustration, so that's one of the reasons why I include them. But it's really about finding your own art style. This is just meant to kind of guide you guys into drawing flowers. As we start to work our way onto the second row of petals, I'm going to start adding some shadow underneath where one petal overlaps onto another petal. And in this new series, I want to show you guys how to draw a bunch of different types of flowers. So I hope you guys are looking forward to it. And if you have any requests for specific flowers, feel free to let me know down in the comments below, or get a hold of me during one of my live streams. We've switched the power hours from Friday evenings to Saturday evenings, same time, same place. Hopefully more people can join us. And while people are still staying at home and staying safe, I'd love to start offering some pop-up live streams during the day just to kind of show whatever projects I'm working on, and just to provide kind of a hangout and social opportunity for people who are missing that socialization. I also want to point out to you guys that this video's been time-lapsed by at least 2, maybe 4. The full flower project took me about an hour to do, but I also want you guys to keep in mind that I was taking photos and videoing the whole thing, and that definitely adds to the time when you're resetting the camera and you're moving things around. If you just block off an hour of time in the evening to draw and ink this, that should be plenty of time. And I would also recommend, if you're looking to improve your floral drawing, draw a bunch of little small flowers. This is a fairly large one. This is on a 5.5 by 8.5 piece of Canson XL sketchbook paper. I would recommend drawing on something smaller while you kind of get your bearings, and then work larger from there. As I mentioned earlier, trying to find a way to do this frequently is going to really improve your drawing skills. Different people like practicing with different things. Flowers are one of the things that brings me a lot of joy, and it gives me just kind of a moment to escape and focus on something beautiful and natural. So I get a lot of pleasure out of practicing drawing flowers and drawing flowers from reference and painting flowers, and that's why there's such a prevalent theme in my work. But it doesn't have to be flowers. It can be any objects that bring you a lot of joy. The more you practice drawing them, the better you're going to get at drawing them. And on that note, I have a bunch of videos in the hopper coming up that kind of teach you volumetric drawing. They're going to teach you how to break down complicated shapes into basic 3D shapes. Those videos were originally recorded for a younger audience. I was teaching a group of 10-year-olds at the time, and it was recorded to help me prep for that class. But I think volumetric drawing is a wonderful teaching tool for anybody who's looking to learn how to draw. It's one of many different ways of seeing the world. So regardless of your age, I think if you're interested in learning how to draw, or you want to take your drawing to a different level, you want to look at the world from a different viewpoint, those videos could be really helpful for you. So as you guys can see, I'm working petal by petal around the flower, adding the detail as I go. Now, often when I'm inking, I'll wait until the end to add my detail, but I draw a lot of flowers, as I've mentioned, so this is something I'm very comfortable with, and I already have a good idea in my mind with how much detail I want to add to this. Now, if you were going to be working in just black and white, you would definitely want to utilize heavier shadows, you'd want to use more spot blacks, you'd want to use more detail. But as I mentioned, I plan on using this for a watercolor marker workshop, so I'm trying to leave my details a little bit lighter and my line work a little bit lighter. So now I'm going in and adding those background leaves and those background water lily pads. As you're inking, it's also perfectly fine to go back in, revise things, refine things with a pencil. No shame in that. This was just a sketch, and it was just designed to provide a framework for our illustration. So since these background water lilies and leaves are not the focus of our illustration, I'm not adding as much detail to them. I'm keeping them kind of light, and that's going to help them recede into the background, and that's also going to help keep the focus on the water lily. You want to kind of vary how much detail you put into different things because that's going to create contrast, and that's going to pull the reader's attention. Generally, you want to offset areas of either lots of detail and lots of contrast against areas with very little detail or contrast, or the opposite. You want to keep things very simple and then have a very complex detailed background. So now I have the basics inked in. I'm going to go in with that Pentel pigment brush pen and add some heavier shadows. This is completely optional. It's up to you, your taste level, your comfort level, and what you're hoping to achieve. But I wanted to just get a little bit more contrast and definition into this piece. Now, you can also do that using whatever color medium you're going to use later, your alcohol markers, your watercolor markers, whatever. You can use that to add in your contrast and your detail, but for this I wanted to go ahead and use the Pentel pigment brush pen. Now this is going to be waterproof once fully cured as well, so I don't have to worry about it reactivating and bleeding out into my watercolor, polluting my color. Something I do want to point out that I talk about in a lot of my other videos where I'm inking is when you're inking with black inks, you're adding a different layer of contrast. So you may choose to ink with colored inks, or you may choose to leave your illustration just a pencil illustration and then just paint really tightly on top of that. Really, it's up to you, and I encourage you to explore with all these different medias and all these techniques to find what works best for you. So I'm just using this brush pen to add some heavier inks, kind of where there would be more shadow. One of the things I really like about this brush pen is it handles a lot like a traditional brush. I'm able to get really fine lines, I'm able to get much thicker lines, and I'm able to get a little bit of dry brush. So this is a very handy inking brush, and it's one I use quite often. But you can see most of my heavier line work is added at the bottom of the petals, creating the illusion of shadow cast onto the petal underneath it, giving us a little bit more depth and giving us a little bit more weight. So here's the finished inked illustration. I'm going to let it dry overnight. This allows the inks to bond to the paper surface, so they're going to be less likely to lift up when we're erasing. And I'll see you guys, I say tomorrow, but really I'll see you guys in a couple seconds. So this has had a chance to dry overnight. I'm going to use a soft white vinyl eraser to erase. I'm using a white stroke here, but I also highly recommend the Pentel High Polymer or the Tombow mono erasers. Those are going to be less likely to cause ghosting. I'm also using a drafting brush. It's not quite in shot, but I'm using it just to remove the eraser dust, and that also allows me to see whether or not there's still some graphite on the paper. Since I'm going to be using this with watercolor markers, it doesn't really matter that much if there's graphite on the paper, but if I wanted to use alcohol markers on top of this, I'd want to be sure to remove as much graphite as possible. Alright, and there is our finished water lily. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful, useful, and informative. Hopefully it'll inspire you in your art, and hopefully it's provided a little bit of guidance. Please let me know down in the comments below if you have any questions about this, and let me know what other flower tutorials you're interested in seeing in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye guys!